it covered. So we left off talking about nucleic acids. We want to finish this one up and hopefully finish off this chapter. So other nucleotides, right? So we talked a little bit about RNA, we talked about DNA. Now we want to talk a little bit about some of the other nucleotides. And there's a couple of them, right? So for instance, this guy right here, which you can see already, because it's got a hydroxyl group at that 2' position, puts this into the ribose group, right? But this guy here, which is an adenine, is your nitrogenous base, and it does something very weird. So far, it's looking kind of like an RNA nucleotide, right? An adenine type of RNA nucleotide. So the question is, how does it differ? Well, it does differ, and it differs basically here in your phosphates. So you notice you don't just have 1 phosphate or 2 phosphates, but you have 3 phosphates. Now, these phosphates tend to have lots of electrons, right? Because the electronegativity of these oxygens. So there's lots of electrons basically around these oxygens. So this basically means that these phosphates are not very happy with each other. So this is a very uncomfortable molecule, right? So these 3 phosphates, because of all these electronic charges, all these charges in close proximity to each other, we know a little bit about what like charges do with each other, right? If you get 2 like charges in close proximity to each other, what do? They just hug each other. They repel, right? So in this particular case, you got all these like charges in close proximity, which means that they are not happy at all, right? The equivalent of this is if you were to take 2 people, 3 people actually in this particular case, who really hate each other. I mean, just really hate each other. And then you stuff them in a broom closet, all 3 of them. And so they're like in the dark and they're like nose to nose with each other, right? It's like you can smell their bad breath. And remember, you hate these people. So the last person on the face of the planet that you want to be nose to nose to is the person that you hate the most. There's a little tension in there, yes? So as soon as I crack that door to open it up, what's going to happen? Yeah, they're going to blow out of there, right? And if I don't get out of the way, I'm going to have a broken nose. So what does that mean? That means that these guys are so unhappy that this last one here is going to blast off of this. And as it does so, just like with the door flinging open, it's going to be accompanied with energy. And guess what? You can use that energy to do something useful. So you can use this to do biological work. So that basically means that this molecule, which is ATP, is essentially our rechargeable battery in the cell. Just like your cell phone. You want to do something on an app? Guess what you got to have? You got to have energy, right? Where does that energy come from? Your battery. But where does that come from? Your wall, right? And guess what you have to do every couple of days or so? You got to recharge it. You want to keep using your phone? You got to keep recharging it. Same thing's also true for ATP. You want to keep doing biological work? You got to keep recharging it. So ultimately, ATP goes through a cycle where it naturally hydrolyzes into ADP plus phosphate. And the little I stands for inorganic phosphate. But guess what? It also expends energy when it does that, right? This is the person angrily throwing open the door and running out because they got to get out. They got to get away, right? Because otherwise they're going to start screaming and killing people in there, right? However, that's what you do when you're trying to essentially do something biological that requires energy. But guess what? Just like with your cell phone battery, you always have to plug it back in and recharge it, right? So there's always a reverse process. By the way, biology, there's always a reverse reaction, right? Always look for the second, the back street. So this one is given to you by cell respiration. So this is basically chapter 7. So the entire process of cell respiration is to essentially take energy, which you get for free from the sun, but not terribly accessible, and figure out a way to get that packed into your cell phone battery so that you can do work. And so that's exactly what we have here. So ATP is oftentimes going back and forth through this cycle. Hydrolysis to give you energy, recharging it through cell respiration so that you can replace that. Just like your cell phone battery. I don't know how many times in the life of a cell phone that you have you recharged your cell phone battery, but it's probably uncountable, a lot, right? And so that's basically your ATP. This is your energy currency of the cell. You want to do work, you got to have this. You don't have this, guess what? You're dead. It's that simple. Okay. There are other nucleotides which are actually also involved in cell respiration. And these guys are electron carriers. So what they basically do is they carry electrons around during the process of cell respiration. And that's kind of part of the role. And these guys are nucleotides themselves, but I don't want to get into the deep, right? Because we kind of talked a little bit about that, right? We talked a little bit about NAD plus when I kind of sketched it out during lab, right? Because we dealt with NADH and we had to deal with that during fermentation. So we kind of got a little bit of that idea. But these guys are nucleotides as well. And to kind of get deeper into their roles of how they behave in cell respiration requires a fuller unpacking of cell respiration, which is something that we do in the energetics take-home exam and is already posted online on the energetics module in terms of lectures. So I don't want to get into that now because that's done somewhere else. Okay. So next group, the lipids. So let's take a look at the lipids. So the lipids basically are unlike the other three in the sense that they're not quite as straightforward. They're not like a straightforward kind of like a brick wall sort of a thing where you've got monomers and you put them together to form polymers. They're a little bit different, right? Because the one thing that was always true about nucleic acids and also proteins is that the monomers were all very much like each other, right? In this case, the lipids, the pieces of lipids are all very distinct and very different. So these lipids are structurally very, very different from each other. So they kind of have a little bit of kind of a looser organization to them. So what pulls them all together? Well, first of all, the fact that they all have a lot of CH bonds in them, right? And what do we know about CH bonds? We learned about this one at the beginning of the chapter. You got a lot of carbon hydrogen bonds, you're probably nonpolar, right? So that also makes you insoluble in water. It also makes you hydrophobic. Those are the things that they all share in common. However, there are different types. So you have fats and oils, you have waxes. I'm going to add steroids are a type of lipid. Even some vitamins are lipids, right? Some vitamins are lipids, and so the lipid soluble vitamins. Know that some of the vitamins are lipid soluble. Those are the lipid vitamins. And that's also the reason why when you take a vitamin, they always say you need to eat this with food. So don't just take a vitamin like, straight on an empty stomach. Is that so, right? So the idea is that you want to eat something. For the lipid soluble vitamins, it allows you to be able to have some lipids in your system so that you can actually get them in, so you can actually absorb them. For others, there's usually a co-absorbent that you need in order to absorb them in, right? And so there's several different reasons why you want to have a little bit of food with your vitamins, not just live on vitamin pills, right? So that's not a good pathway to health. But let's go ahead and take a look structurally at the fats and oils first. And then we'll look at a couple of variations of this, and then we'll land on steroids, and that's typically right about the end of this chapter. So first of all, when we take a look at fats, we want to first of all take a look at the fat molecule. The fat molecule itself is actually a fairly straightforward structure. It is part carbohydrate, glycerol, which is a 3-carbon molecule. And we saw that in the earlier chapter, right? In the carbohydrates, we saw the 3-carbon sugar, right? And then we saw the 5-carbon sugars, and we saw the 6-carbon sugars. So this is a glycerol version. And then to this backbone, you have attached 3 fatty acids, which are essentially long chains of carbon with an acid head. That's all it is. That's why they're called fatty acids. So if you take a look at a fatty acid, I'm just going to draw one right about here. So you have a carboxylic acid. Let's start off with that one. And then the rest of this is just a long chain of carbons. So that's your fatty acid. So to this backbone then is going to be attached 3 fatty acids. And if you recall, I defined what this little zigzag line meant right in the first slide of the chapter. So this is typically where I use this notational system. So here you can see you've got 3 fatty acid tails attached to 1 glycerol backbone, hence the term triglyceride. Okay, so this is 1 fat molecule. So in a single fat molecule, you actually have 3 fatty acids attached to it. Now, fatty acids themselves come in a lot of varieties and shapes. So they're not all the same. You have short chain, you have mid chain, you have long chain fatty acids. Some fatty acids we metabolize quite well, others not so much. Some are actually good for our lipid metabolism, like things like flaxseed oil, fish oil, things like that. The omegas, right? 3, 6, and 9. Those are typically the good fatty acids that help our lipid metabolism along. And then, of course, you have some that are not so great. But there's a couple of different types of fats that we're going to take a look at. And the first one I want to start off with is the unsaturated fats. And we're going to talk about saturated fats, and we're going to talk about unsaturated fats, and we're going to talk about at the end about trans fats. And I'm going to get trans fats set up over here. And I'll come back to this later. Let's take a look at saturated first. A saturated fat is basically a fat that has a long chain of carbons with no double bonds in them. Like what I just wrote up here, that's a saturated fat. All those carbons are connected to each other through single bonds. So, and the reason why we get the term saturated is because it's fully saturated with hydrogens. So it's maximally filled with hydrogens, saturated with hydrogens, if you will. Okay. Now, here's the thing. When you have a saturated fat like this, a fatty acid tail, what this typically does is this essentially means that this is kind of a straightish looking tail. So this tail actually will kind of look fairly straight like that. What that means is you can pack these saturated fats very tightly, very close together, in close proximity to each other. Okay. Kind of like they stack on top of each other, like just right next to each other. And so what that means then is per unit space, you're going to have more fatty acids. And so generally speaking, because of this close packing, you tend to be able to get a higher melting point. And they tend to be of animal origin. So here's a good example. If I asked you to go get some saturated fat and bring it back to me, what would you come back with? What? Okay, animal, yep. What else? I like that. That's actually unusual. I don't usually get that one, but go ahead. Yeah, lard, that's probably an easier one to get, right? I mean, right? So I mean, the idea is shortening, right? Something that at room temperature is in what state? Yeah, it's solid, right? But notice it's all animal origin, right? Like in the old days when you used to save the bacon grease, those were like the really old days, right? I mean, like old farm families that just, you know, they couldn't go to the store and just grab oil to cook with or something like that. It's like, what would they do? They'd have to save like the bacon grease, right? And then they'd have to, that's the lipid that they would use to cook with. So everything tasted like bacon. Your beans tasted like bacon, right? Which for some of us is great, for others of us not, right? So, but that's kind of, they're all the same, right? Bacon grease at room temperature is, it's a solid, right? That's because it's got a high melting temperature because it's mostly saturated fats. They stack in close to each other. Now, if you take a look at an unsaturated fat, basically an unsaturated fat is defined by a chain, just like this, that has one, if it's monounsaturated, or more double bonds if it's polyunsaturated. So if I want to turn this particular chain that I've got up here into an unsaturated, all I have to do is toss in a double bond there. Toss in a double bond, it is now monounsaturated. I got to eliminate one of these guys. If I want to toss in another double bond, it is now polyunsaturated, and so we'd basically get rid of these guys here. So that would be an unsaturated fatty acid. So here's the deal with the unsaturated. When you toss in a double bond, what it does is it forms a kink in the tail. So that's a monounsaturated, it's got one kink in the tail. If it's polyunsaturated, it's going to have multiple kinks in the tail. In this case, I've got 1, 2, 3 kinks in the tail. Okay. So that has 3 different double bonds in it. So what's the consequences of this? Well, the consequences of this is the fact that these don't pack together quite as tightly. And so because of that, the melting point of an unsaturated fat is fairly low. So at room temperature, what state is it in? It's a liquid. And it's typically a plant origin. So if I told you to go out and give me some unsaturated fat, what'd you come back with? Olive oil, rapeseed oil, right? Vegetable oil, some sort of an oil, right?
Why is coconut oil solid?
Because, well, we'll talk about that actually. So you can kind of mess with that, right? So obviously not all lipids from plants are unsaturated. That makes sense. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And so what I want to do is I want to kind of come back to trans fats, but before I do that, I want to go to this slide and sort of break some of this stuff down. I want to talk about two major things. I want to talk about some nutritional things on this that kind of ties in the trans fats ideas. And then I want to talk about the segue to the next lipid, which is the phospholipid, Christopher.
Sorry, I'm going to try to phrase this educational. How is there normally a limit to carbons for the unsaturated and saturated, or is it?
You mean to how long your chain can be? Technically speaking, there's no limit. I mean, you can make your fatty acid chain as long as you want. Functionally speaking, there is a limit. Because obviously, if you've got this big, long chain, it becomes a little just practically unwieldy to deal with. So your long chains even have a limit to them. And that's just because it's just difficult to handle. Right. So this is an example. So this guy right here is your saturated. So you can see, first of all, your acid group. So there's your acid head right there. Right. And so it goes through a dehydration reaction and it forms this guy right there. That is the linking bond. That's an ester bond. Remember we said an ester is basically a carbon oxygen, kind of a carbon situation, right? Only in this case, it's a straight ester, right? Because that oxygen is not part of a phosphate. So it's not a phosphodiester like we saw with the nucleic acids. So let's review the four bonds that hold these things together. Holding together the carbohydrates is that's the ester bond, but hiding the carbohydrates together. I'm rolling back a bit. Remember there's three of them, 1, 2, 1, 4, 1, 6. Ooh, we got some work to do before the exam, right? The glycosidic bond, right? Holding together proteins is the peptide bond, right? Holding together nucleotides is the phosphodiester bond. Holding together the fats, ester, right? Okay, so, and you see you're basically holding these guys together and you can see that they're basically long linear chains of carbon, all singly bound to each other. So this is a saturated. So notice how straight the tails are. They pack in nice and tight like that. So that's a saturated fat triglyceride. Now the unsaturated, you can see over here. So you can see each of the chains is different. In this case, you got 2 double bonds in there. So that's a polyunsaturated fat. This guy here only has 1, right? So that'd be a monounsaturated fatty acid in there. And this one here has 3, so that'd be a polyunsaturated. So this would be an unsaturated fatty acid. You can see how it kind of forms this little kink in the tail every time it runs into a double bond. And you can see how there's extra space because those tails just basically get into each other's way. And so they can't pack in nice and tight because they're kind of all sort of like cramming into and sort of elbowing each other in the ribs and that sort of stuff. Okay, so they don't tack as tightly together. So let's take a look at some of the nutritional consequences to that. One of the things that cardiologists always advise their patients, so several decades ago, because of heart disease purposes, is they would always advise their patients to stop eating saturated fats. Why? Because you would basically be accumulating lipids, and then that could clog your arteries, and then that's a bad thing, right? Well, let's take a look at this. Here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to I'm going to give you an example of why we don't like saturated fats and why cardiologists say, like, listen, if you got to eat fats, try to get something that has unsaturated fats in it. Poly preferably, mono at least, right? So if you can choose between fully unsaturated versus some polyunsaturated fats in there, always pick the poly. Why? Because we're going to boil a chip, one of my favorites. In saturated fats, we're going to boil it in mono, unsaturated, and we're going to boil it in poly. We're going to compare them. So in a saturated fat oil, when you are boiling that chip, you're soaking that chip in all these little straight chain tails of saturated fat. And so you're going to have a lot of fatty acids per chip. Now in mono, since you got that kink in the tail, the monos are still going to be in there, and you're going to be able to like get some in there, but it's going to be a little trickier, right? Because they kind of crowd each other out a little bit because of that kink. Now in poly, depending on how many you're talking about, you have multiple kinks in the tail, which is going to make it even more difficult. Did you boil the chip? Yes. But which one would be better to eat? This one. Why? You have fewer fatty acids per chip, right? And so health-wise, that's the reason why cardiologists will always advise you, listen, try to stay away from the saturated. If you see something with a mixture of unsaturated in there, go for that, right? Because that would be a healthier lipid choice for your diet purposes. The other thing that they also realized health-wise, and we're going to tie this now into trans fats, because a lot of times people will be like, okay, what are trans fats? Well, we'll talk about what trans fats are in just a second. But one of the things that doctors noticed is that whenever they do a lipid panel on you, when they check your cholesterol, they check several things. They check your free triglycerides, how much fat-free is free flowing in your blood, right? The more, the worse it is. That means you're eating too many lipids. But then they do what? They check LDL and HDL. What are those? That's your so-called cholesterol, right? It's actually not cholesterol. Yeah, so these are actually, what LDL stands for is low density lipoprotein. Remember we talked about the proteins, we said one of their functions was as a storage protein? Well, lipids, like oil, can't just free flow in your bloodstream because your bloodstream is mostly water. And we all know what oil and water does, don't we? It just basically stratifies, so it wouldn't go anywhere. So your cholesterol is actually carried around by one of these storage proteins, lipoproteins, whose job it is to grab onto the cholesterol and to sort of shuttle it around your blood. You actually have quite a few of these shuttle proteins in your blood plasma. This one, the low density version of the lipoprotein, is sticky. And so what it has a tendency to do is as it goes through your system, now the more cholesterol you eat, the more of this lipoprotein you make to carry the cholesterol. And then it tends to get stuck in the liners of your arteries, right? Notice I said the liners, not like on the surface of your arteries. That'd be easy, just scrub it out, right? But in the liners of your arteries. And it gets stuck there. And then it starts to build up plaque, and then that's going to occlude your artery, and you're going to have a heart attack, right? So that's arterial plaquing. So saturated fats will increase your LDL numbers, which is bad, right? But the good thing is, HDL, the high density lipoprotein, is your good cholesterol. Why is it good? Because what this one does is it comes in and it basically keeps the LDL from sticking. So it doesn't quite scrub it out, right? But in conjunction with LDL, it keeps the LDL from being so sticky, so it's less likely to lodge in your liner. And so the more HDL you have, the better. Now, how do you get this one? Through exercise. So this is one of the reasons, by the way, why all doctors pretty much on the face of the planet will agree at least on two pieces of advice. Everybody should be eating a sensible diet and exercising. Now, where they fly off the rails with each other is, what do we mean by sensible diet? Every crazy Yahoo out there has their own idea. Most of them are wrong. And then, of course, what do we mean by exercise? Because when a doctor tells you to exercise for this purpose, they're not talking about going to CrossFit. They're not talking about kettlebells. They're not talking about powerlifting. They're not talking about any of that. They're talking about a very recent addition to the fitness pantheon, which is purely focused on physiological tone, which to the muscle head doesn't look like exercise to them. But actually, physiologically, it's like magic to your body, which is the reason why most cardiologists will tell their patients, like, listen, I don't care what you do or how long you do it necessarily. But what I want you to do is I want you to do something, and I want you to do it continuously. Like some of our cardiologists that I work with would actually tell our patients, like, listen, if all you do is just walk for 10 minutes, that's fine. But do it 10 minutes every day and do it consistently and continuously, because physiologically, there's infinitely more power and benefit in just a simple 10-minute walk, continuously done every single day, than running a marathon one day and doing nothing in between, which is how most American fitness is organized, right? What do? You beat your body up and then you go into recovery and rebuild mode. Isn't that how it works? Stupid. Not right. That is not physiological smartness right there, right? Physiology needs consistent, low-level activity to bring your tonal levels up, because that's what physiology is about, right? Not your peaks and your troughs, your tonal baseline. That's what you want to bring up. And that's the reason why exercise is a good thing, right? Now, let's take a look then at trans fats. Health-wise, what do trans fats do? Now, here's the thing, right? Because what doctors would do is they basically take a look at their patients. They'd be like, my gosh, man, your like HDL levels are just in the toilet. You got to be exercising. You got to do something, get active, get that HDL up. And your LDL levels are just astronomical. So you got to stop eating lipids. Well, guess what the patients would do? They would do what they're told, right? Because nobody wants to die. And heart disease really hits home to all of us, right? Because most of us know somebody with heart disease in our family. Some of us will have heart disease, right? It's very close to home because it's like the #1 killer in the country. Now, I would argue that actually everybody dies of heart disease. Everybody, all 8 billion of us. Why? Because we define life and death by our heartbeat. So eventually all of us will die of a heart attack. All of us, 100% of us, right? That's how we define life. So here's the thing. We'd have patients to be like, but I'm just going to stop eating like lipids. I'm going to really dial it all back, and I'm going to start exercising, all that sort of stuff. But then what the doctor realized was it wasn't working. They're like, you need to stop eating saturated fats. And the patient was like, but I'm not eating anything. I mean, it's like, don't eat anything that casts a shadow. I mean, it's like, how can my lipid numbers be so high? Well, what they realized, what the real devil was, right? Because demons always hide in the shadows. They never come out to play in the broad daylight. Well, what we did was we found out that trans fats actually do a double whammy. They increase your LDL and they knock down your HDL. What we realized was what was causing people's lipid numbers wasn't their eating and consumption of saturated fats necessarily, but it was the consumption of trans fats. So exactly, so their trans fats are really bad. So what is actually a trans fat? Simply said, trans fat is basically a type of double bond. So it's kind of like making the coin. Remember we made the coin, we said that if you make a coin, you're going to make both sides. You can't not make both sides. You're going to have both. Well, if you make a double bond, you're going to make two different conformations. It's like a heads and tails. It's like a right hand, left hand. It's going to come as part of the deal. In one of those, coming into the double bond will be your R group, your chain, your carbon chain. If it exits and enters on the same side of the double bond, it's what we refer to as cis. Some of you may recognize that term, like in terms of gender identification, right? A cis male or a cis female or something like that. That means same. Cis means the same side. Okay, that's basically what that means. This is good because we have enzymes for cis. Okay. Trans is if your chain comes in one side and exits the other side. This is your trans conformation. This one is bad. Why? Because trans conformations don't exist in nature. Just like all of your amino acids are left-handed, all of your carbon double bonds are cis-handed. So you have enzymes to deal with that. but you don't have enzymes to deal with trans. Not only that, but it's not a natural source. There's a little bit of trans in meat, but not much. Just like red meat. Yeah, or like red meat. So the question is, where does it come from then? This is purely man-made, right? So this is actually a type of preservative. Think about it. How many of you guys love Twinkies? Be honest. They're disgusting, but they're great, right? So think about this for a second. The Twinkie that you buy today, in 3,000 years, the archaeologists will be able to eat. Why? Because of all the preservatives, right? It's mostly a sponge of chemicals. That's mostly what a Twinkie is. Anything. Yeah, the quarter pounder that's been in somebody's back seat for like 10 years. Yeah, that's disturbing, right? I love quarter pounders. But anyway. Huh? Yeah. And the rest of it is all good. Yeah. So I mean, a lot of that's scary, right?
But I've heard it's more transplant ID, the longer I'll live, and archaeologists will find me in 3 years.
Well, you won't live. You'll be dead. You'll be like a mummy. Yeah, you'll be like Lenin, right? You'll be on display. So you'll be like a perfectly preserved corpse. So taxidermy. Yeah. Well, then they have to like take her skin off, and that gets a little gory. But anyway, right? So this is great. This is a new low for me, right? I'm skinning students, and we're killing them and preserving them like mummies. So that's a thing. But no, where did these come from, right? Because we're bathed in a society that's full of preservatives. That's just the way we are. That's just where we are, right? So the question is, where did these come from? Well, I can tell you where they came from. It was actually a necessary evil. Think about it. At the turn of the 20th century, right, the 1900s, America in particular, this is where a lot of this came from, other countries kind of followed suit, was we were going from an agrarian society, right, where basically we grow our own food and we had farms, and we were slowly moving to urban centers and leaving the farm behind, right? So if you take a look at what life is like on a farm, it's very different than what life is like for us. Because on a farm back in those days, and in the 19th century, you didn't have grocery stores. They didn't exist. The best you would have is like a mercantile store. And most of what they would have is dry goods, but not a lot, right? They might have some flour, maybe some sugar, but just some canned stuff. But mostly it was pretty bare. It was pretty sparse, right? So the question is, where did you get your food from? Well, you had to grow it, right? And if you've ever grown vegetables, you know, it's like, how did people live this way, right? Because you had to, and the way you shopped or the way you planned your meals, I'm just like talking about just normal like home economics. I mean, like just the economizing the home. Like if you go about the day and say like, okay, we have to eat dinner today. What are we going to make for dinner, right? Everybody kind of does that eventually, right? They're like, okay, what am I going to have for dinner today? For us, it's easy. We just go down to McDonald's or whatever, eat the quarter pounder and the Shamrock Shake, and we're good, right? So I know, right? So it's like, I've already had my Shamrock Shake for the year, so I'm good. So I have to leave that alone now, but I'll anticipate its arrival next year. So I'm bad, but I try to minimize my badness. Right. So the idea is you didn't just go and shop the way we shop. Think about it. How do most go to King Supers and just watch people just go through the line? How are people shopping? They got produce in there, right? They've got, if they're healthy-ish or so. That's the reason why I didn't pick Walmart, because you don't do produce at Walmart. Most of it is just like donuts and stuff like that. But anyway, right. But you got like a lot of produce in there, don't you? If you take a look at any person's cart and ask them, are you going to be eating this tonight for dinner? What's the answer going to be? Mostly no, right? Well, then why are you buying it now? Because you're buying a week ahead of time. Sometimes that stuff's going to be there in a month if it's frozen, right? So you planned ahead, and that's how you shop. You couldn't do that on a farm. Why? Because there is no refrigeration. There is no preservatives, right? Salt. That was your preservative. That was it. Canning was a good thing. Yeah, you could bury it, but I mean, that's kind of that's an old ancient Indian trick, right? A quite effective one, actually. Right, pickling and canning, that was their thing, but that was designed to get you over winter, right? Pickling and canning. So the question is, what are you going to eat today? Are you going to go out there and harvest everything and buy a whole bunch of stuff? No, you're going to only buy exactly what you need for today. Why? Because tomorrow it's going to be bad. Because there's no way to preserve it. I mean, we like bananas, for instance, right? I mean, those go bad quickly. I mean, they're just laying there and just like, oh, I didn't even have a chance to get to those things. They're already like greasy black peel. So banana bread, here we come, right? Or smoothie, that's a good one, right? So yeah, I mean, so it's like you have this perishability issue. So you're limited to only buying what you have, what you can eat that day. And then the next day is another day's fight, right? It's like, well, I hope there's something for us today, right? So every day you never knew really what was going on. So you couldn't plan your meals in advance like that, like we do now. Until we started moving to urban centers. So once we started moving to urban centers, we didn't have fields that we were working that we could pull from. We didn't have animals that we could slaughter for dinner that night. We didn't have eggs to collect because we were in a city now. So the question was, how do I get a hold of my dinner if I'm in a city and I don't have a farm to back up on? By the way, this is like the reason why farm life is tough, because like half the family would be out in the field making sure that crop took, because if it didn't took, I mean, it wasn't just like, shucks, I guess I'm not going to be able to sell my wheat today. No, it was like, holy shite, this could be the winter we all die. Literally, right? Because that crop was designed to get you through the winter, because nothing's growing in the winter. This is one of the reasons why those farming communities are so close to each other and why they have natural co-ops. Because when your field gets hit by the tornado, your good friend down the way who didn't get hit is going to be your lifeline to get through the winter. They're going to make sure, listen, you know what? Next year, maybe it's me that gets hit by the tornado. So I want you to come on in. I want you to enjoy my crop because we all take care of each other. That's the reason why you had that kind of community bond in agrarian societies, because they needed each other to survive. And they all knew it. They were all one disaster away from absolute tragedy. They all knew that. So as you started moving to cities, then merchants started to pick up food, and they started realizing, well, wait a minute, if I want to do produce, then I got to keep this produce on the shelf long enough so that my customers can buy it. Because not everybody's going to buy the vegetables for that day's meal, right? So they might buy it tomorrow or the day after that or the day after that, but I need to make sure that that's fresh and that's ready to go and it's good so that they can actually purchase that for their dinner. So what happened is, as we started to move into cities, we started running into this shelf life issue, right? So grocery stores needed to figure out how to keep things on the shelves longer so that customers could make their way into the stores and the product could be there when they needed it, okay? In order to do that, you had to start preserving things. And that's where the influx of chemical preservatives came in. One of those was trans fats. So in our need to expand shelf life to create essentially the grocery industry, we needed to add preservatives, and trans fats was one of them. That's where they came from. So that's the reason why, by the way, and I always challenge students to do this. Think about this for a minute. Go through a grocery store, take a look at the expiration date, and just don't like, or anything like that. Just take a look at what it is, and then take a look at the actual item. And then ask yourself, if I actually were to make this in my kitchen, how long would it last? Like a Twinkie is a good example, right? All a Twinkie is basically dough and cream, right? It's a baked item. If you were to make something like a Twinkie in your house, how long would it last? Depends, right? A couple of days, and then it's not going to be edible. So when you compare what if you make it in your kitchen, it's only going to be around for a few days, and you see an expiration date on there for like, oh, it's good until next year, the year after that. The gap between those two is filled in with chemicals. Think about it. When you go to the grocery store, take a look at what you're buying and ask yourself, how long would this actually last if I were to make it in my house? The difference between the expiration date and how long it would last in your house if you made it from scratch is made up by these preservative chemicals.
What about the milk, like the one from Walmart, it's like it expires in like a week after 2 weeks, but then you get that organic kind of milk and it says it expires in like 2 weeks, no, not in 2 months. Like what, why, if it's organic, why is it?
So expiration dates are actually driven by the company that makes it. So a great value jug of milk is set by Walmart, but the organic company will set their own. And the other thing also with Walmart that's really a Walmart effect is Walmart kind of plays around with their expiration dates because they know that half of the crap that's in their refrigeration unit has spent an unfortunate amount of time out there in the clothes. Coming down to room temperature, basically shrinking that expiration period by a lot, which is one of the reasons why you get a jug of milk and you bring it home and it's like bad in a day, even though you technically should have a week. Yeah, that's because somebody put that in the underwear section and it got lost there for like who God knows how long, right? And that's one of the reasons why I always have to be careful, like when shopping at Walmart, because they're not good at that at all.
Why are these methods so focused on?
Don't. It's because of salmonella. It's because if an egg does get through and has salmonella in it, then it's not going to populate in the refrigerator, and so it reduces the likelihood of food poisoning. Whereas if it's at room temperature, that salmonella can grow, and if you happen to get a bad egg, it's going to make you sick. If that was at room temperature. What? Well, just different culture. I mean, it's just as simple as that. It's just a different way they look. I mean, there's a lot of things that Europeans don't do that we do because we're really kind of high strung. Americans are a little on the high strung side. So, yeah. Yes. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about what I call the margarine effect. And what is the margarine effect? I'm going to write it right here. Let me explain it to you. If you take a look at a saturated fat, it's a solid at room temperature, yes? And an unsaturated is a liquid at room temperature. I'm going to give you a scenario of the reason why margarine was created. Margarine's not natural, by the way, right? We created it in about the 50s or 60s. And here's the reason why. Let's imagine you're getting up in the morning, you're ready to go to work, right? One of the classic 50s, 60s on the go breakfast was just basically a couple of pieces of toast. You butter it, grab your coffee, you're gone, right? Think about this for a second. If you got your toast in the toaster, it pops up, it's all nice and warm, not flaming hot, right? But it's toast warm. And then you want to basically butter it, and you grab out of the refrigerator a nice little brick of butter. What is that butter like? Real butter. No, real butter. What you're describing to me is margarine. Yeah, if you've ever dealt with real butter, it is hard. You can hammer nails with it, right? I remember as a kid working with real butter and getting the knife in there. I'm like, just put my whole body weight on there just to cut off a little piece of it. So,
On that, like leaving it at room temperature, like with real butter.
that'll soft. Yeah, that'll soften it up. But
is there like you can take butter out, like, covered, refrigerator version.
yeah, I mean, fats do get rancid. They do get rancid. It takes a long time for them to do that. Chances are you'll consume the butter before that happens. But in this case, we put it in the refrigerator. So that's why you're cheating now, right? So, yeah, we could put it out in room temperature, and that's what people did. But that kind of mushes it up pretty good, depending on how hot the house gets. So if it's a warm day, It's just all, ugh, right? So that's not really good, right? So if you take that solid brick of butter and you try to butter your toast, what's going to happen? Have you ever tried this? What? Yeah, you're going to have like shreds of toast, right? Because the butter's not going to, it's not, you can put it on there, it's not going to melt. Why? Because the melting temperature is too high. So what's your strategy then? Well, I got other oils or other things, right? So let's go ahead and grab like, you know, an oil or something like that, right? Olive oil, whatever. Is that going to work to butter to spread on your toast? No, because it's a liquid, right? So you can stick your knife in there. It's like, well, that doesn't really work very well because it doesn't really stay on the knife. You can use a spoon, and maybe I can kind of drizzle it over there. But then if you're not really that gifted, I mean, you're gonna have some pockets that are gonna just look like a grease sponge. And you're gonna look at this thing, it's like, well, this really doesn't look all that great. So I'm just gonna stick with coffee and I'm going, right? So you can see on one side, it's too hard. On the other, it's not hard enough. Enter the margarine effect. How do we change this? Well, what we did was we engineered our own lipid. And all we did was basically mess with the melting temperature, right? One case is too high, the other case is too low. And what we wanted is the perfect melting point where it would set up in the refrigerator like a stick of butter. But when you took it out and it met the temperature of the toast, it would melt. That's the melting point right there of the spread, so that you can soften it up and spread it on toast. How did we do this? We did this simply by mixing saturated and unsaturated fats, fatty acids. I mean, it's like any other lipid. I mean, it's just saturated fats and unsaturated fats. So it's just like a combination of real butter and oil. So it's,
But it's not a trans.
no, shouldn't have any trans fats in it. It used to, right? But yeah, that's the reason why. Because what happened was when we figured this out, the cardiologist pretty much screamed at the industry. And to believe it or not, unlike the smoking industry, which took generations to change, the snack industry turned on a dime because they realized, wait a minute, this is not just a thing. I mean, heart disease affects so many of our customers. Some of our customers have it. Most of our customers know somebody who has heart disease. This is a big deal. If people turn on us, we're screwed. So they changed on a dime. That was actually impressive how they changed. But if you're mixing and matching to get your perfect melting point, then that's basically the margarine effect, right? So if you have a mixture of saturated fats, you're going to have a more solid-like lipid. You can soften that up by adding in unsaturated fats to that mixture. And so you could have a mixture of unsaturated fats that is way on the unsaturated fat side. So it's going to be a little softer and a little runnier. You can have a margarine that's basically a little firmer, a little stiffer by having more unsaturated fats or anything in between, right? And you see this actually in the margarine industry, right? Because you'll see different types of margarine. Some of them are actually quite solid. They kind of sell them in the packages. We usually use them for baking as a replacement for butter, and they kind of have little marks on there. And you kind of cut them. But those typically are on the more saturated side of it. So they're a little bit firmer, right? So that you can work with it. And then the most recent addition to the margarine family has been the spreads, right? Those are the tubs, which are all soft and whipped, right? And those are more unsaturated in nature so that you can sort of, they're softer so you can get them up and spread them. So they're kind of more on the unsaturated side of things. And you can like get any kind of a lipid or a margarine in between there and get different consistencies. More saturated, more firm, more unsaturated, more thin and runny and soft. Okay. Now, is that a question coming up? Nothing really knows what to do with trans fats. Trans fats are just so foreign to your body just doesn't know what to do with it. I mean, it not real well, because the thing is, the HDL itself, because remember, a trans fat is just a fatty acid. So that's going to be bundled into your triglycerides. But the effect of that is is that normally what happens is with your fatty acids, you use them, right? So it's like you're carrying them around, but then you use them to burn for fuel or energy or things like that. With a trans fat, you can't really use it. So it just kind of sticks around and hangs around, which means that you can't ever get away from your LDL, right? So if you reduce your saturated fat consumption, then literally you'll basically reduce your number of LDL molecules because you don't need as many, right? So your LDLs, you can make more if you're eating lots of lipids, but if you back away from the lipids, then you can just basically get rid of the ones you're not using and you can shrink that population, which is how your LDL goes down. But in trans fats, they're perpetually stuck in there. So you can never actually empty out your LDLs. So they hang around and they never go away because you can't use them. So they're just like permanently stuck there. It's like a taxi cab, right? A taxi, a person gets in there, then they get out, then they get in there, and then they get out. But if you put a dead body in there, it's like, well, this person's not getting out. So they're just like perpetually stuck in my cab. So I can't really pick anybody up or function like a taxi cab driver because I got this dead body in my backseat and it's not going away. So I have to drive around with this dead body. And that's kind of like dysfunctional.
Does it persist? I mean, like, how long does it take?
The trans fats? That's a good question. I don't know what the ultimate breakdown is, like what the destiny in terms of excretion for trans fats. My concern is that once you get them, and they're kind of stuck there. Low density lipoproteins versus high density lipoproteins. So the margarine effect is very important in the construction of our phospholipids, which are basically a derivation of the triglyceride. So you still have the same glycerol backbone, right? So you have the same 3-carbon molecule. In this case, you have your 2 fatty acids. But instead of a 3rd fatty acid, on this last one, you have a polar phosphate head. And that's your phospholipid. This is an important molecule for a couple of reasons. First of all, let's take a look at some of the representations of the phospholipid. So you can see here, this is the nerd version right here. So you can see you've got basically these nonpolar hydrophobic tails and these polar hydrophilic heads. Now in this phosphate head, you'll see that you got a phosphate group here, but attached to it is also a choline, which is also polar. So this head group is really, really polar. But here's the thing. Notice these guys are linked together with covalent bonds. That means they're tethered. They're part of the same thing. Is this phospholipid, is this a happy molecule? Why not? Well, I'm just referring to this guy right here. Nope. You can do lots of different variations in there. Like those are just the fatty acids, so you can mix and match those. If you want them both straight, you can do that. Is this a happy customer? Is this a happy molecule? Think about it. Half of you is polar. The other half of you is non-polar. Are you happy with yourself? No. How does non-polars and polars feel about each other? Yeah, right? Think about that. This is all trapped in the same skull. It's like having ultimate good and ultimate evil in the same skull, right? This is a molecule that is equally driven by self-hate to the point of homicide or suicide. But it's also driven at the same time by self-love at the same time. So you're talking about half of your psyche wants to kill the other half, but it wants to live, so it can't kill the other half. So it's like, I love myself, I hate myself, I love myself, I hate myself, right? To titanic proportions. So would this be a mentally healthy molecule? Would you argue that there's a little bit of tension in there? Right? Yeah. Right. So if this were an individual, we're talking about some serious psychotic fracture here. Right. I mean, this is a person where it's like, probably the best outcome for you is to put you in a medically induced coma. That's probably the best thing to do for you right now. Right. And just kind of let you live out the rest of your life in a coma. Yeah, there we go. Right. Screw the psychologist. It's all about biology now. That'd be brutal. But anyway, yeah, it's like you've already reproduced, you've already met your goal, so you're off with you, right? Yeah, medically induced coma. There you go. Right. So the thing about tension, and tension is a key piece, right? Because this is actually a biological. When you get good at this, you'll actually, a lot of the motivation behind things that happen in biology seem less random and seem much more intentional. And a lot of that has to do with tension. So tension always demands resolution.
And is that always between polar and nonpolar, or is that
Tension can come from anywhere. You can create tension anywhere, anyhow. As a matter of fact, the idea of tension demanding resolution is actually kind of a universal idea. So you actually see it cut across a lot of different areas in a lot of different disciplines. And we see it a lot in biology, where you specifically manipulate a system to create tension so that you can get a favorable resolution, because you know that it's screaming for resolution. One of the examples of tension that has absolutely nothing to do with science, just to prove to you how ubiquitous the idea of tension resolution is, it's actually you're kind of like at the end of a puppet string if you think about it when it comes to tension resolution. You don't even realize it. Because we force them together. Yeah, because there's actually physically like an enzyme that forces them together. Yeah. So they're not doing that by choice. That's kind of something that like an enzyme will do when you're making these lipids. I mean, so obviously it's got to have the ability to grab the other one, and smash them together. So you can imagine that there's going to be some issues with this enzyme that we're going to have to make sure it's like, okay, you need some energy to do this, right? Because you got to strong arm this guy, and you got to put them all together, right? Just like cops have to handcuff you together, right? They have to be able to overcome both of you. So the same thing's true for the enzyme, right? But this idea, the ubiquitous nature of tension resolution, I want to use an example from, and here I go. Right, I want to use an example from music to just show you where we see tension resolution. And I want to use not current music, not like 21st century music, because most music in the 21st century is pretty shallow. And most songwriters, actually, even the good ones, they don't have any clue what they're doing. And most of them actually just sort of luck into a tune. They have no clue why their song was popular. They just sort of dumb luck their way into it. So I don't want to talk about this century, because music is actually pretty pathetic actually in this century. I want to go back a few centuries. I want to go into classical music. And I want to go somewhere very specific. I want to go into the classical era. And I want to drop on one particular composer in that era that we all kind of know, Mozart. Right? Because even if we don't like classical music, most of us can recognize a Mozart tune. Usually it's like a little lullaby, but we recognize it. So one of the things I did at UC Davis as my dreaded gen ed class, right, is because we all had to take a class on the other side of campus where, we all thought we just kind of hold hands and talk about our feelings. And every science student dreaded that one. But I saw a Mozart class come up and I took it because I liked Mozart already. And so I'm like, well, let's be kind of interesting. At the worst, what is it? We just sit around and we hold hands and listen to Mozart. I mean, okay. I might have to pepper spray a couple of people, but I mean, at least the Mozart's going to be good, right? I mean, I can live with Mozart for a semester, or actually this is a quarter. So it was only 8 weeks. So I figured I could live through anything for 8 weeks. But actually, as it turned out, it was a fascinating class because the lady who taught it was actually a Mozart scholar. She was like a German lady, and she was like a musicologist. So she actually taught the musicology of Mozart. So Mozart was like her research. She researched Mozart. And you didn't just sit around and listen to Mozart. What you did was she actually dissected it. She actually went into his symphonic form And she said, listen, symphonies have form and structure. There's formulas to them, especially in the classical era, right? The first movement was the sonata movement. And then typically you would have a slow movement, like an adagio. The third movement would be like a waltz, a 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 type of a movement of various sorts. And then you would follow again with another allegro sonata, kind of a skipping kind of a tune that sort of sends you out the door, you know, kind of all pumped up. But what she did was she basically took the first movement. She said, let's break down what he's doing. And actually in the movement itself, there's a formula. So there's 3 different sections. There's like an introductory section where Mozart introduces his melodies. And it's not just a melody, which is what we do now, right? We're lucky if we get a melody, but Mozart would like weave in 4 or 5 different melodies. And he'd introduce them in the first one. And he would bounce them between 2 different keys called a tonic and a dominant. So the 2 different types of keys. And then what he would do is he would kind of spend some time in the dominant, go down to the tonic and back up and then back down. And then he would introduce those major melodies. And then the middle section was called the development section. So this is where Mozart basically said, okay, now that you understand my melodies, now I'm going to play with them. Now I'm going to just start going nuts, improvising and just kind of playing around with them. And this is where he basically set melodies against each other. So he put 2 different melodies in opposition to each other. And when they would collide, it would create dissonances that would sound kind of like, ooh, that kind of hurt a little bit on the ears, like a dissonance, right? So that creates a sense of tension. And he would basically weave these techniques to create a sense of building stress in the music, because we could hear these melodies colliding and clashing with each other. And we naturally want them to work out. Our brain wants to hear something. If you've ever heard like a song and then it stops and then you kind of fill in the blank, that's your brain yearning for the resolution. Charlie Blackmon does this, right? His walk-up song is great, right? Because it cuts off, right? I don't want to lose your love tonight, right? But it stops, right? It says, I don't want to lose your love. And it stops right there. And then the whole crowd goes, tonight, right? Because it creates a tension that then the whole crowd wants to hear. So what do? They naturally get the resolution, right? Mozart does the same thing as he's weaving through this development, creating all these little tension spots. And it's like, you're like, emotionally, you're sort of like, okay, I want this to work out. And then at the end, he ties them all together. They all sort of weave together. And it's like, that was great. Let's go listen to it again, right? And so he intentionally did that, creating tension for the purpose of resolution. The closest equivalent we have now is movie music. How many of you guys have watched a horror movie without the sound on? It's pretty, do it. It's like, whatever, right? But how many of you guys have listened to the score for the horror movie without the movie? You can feel your emotions like, right? As the guy comes on, you don't necessarily even know what the movie was about, but just emotionally, you can feel like the composer is bringing you to this really tense place of tension, right? You're like, something dramatic must have been happening here. I don't know what it was, but like, I can feel myself about ready to explode because there's so much tension and emotion in me. And then of course, it brings you down, right? It's like, okay, now that you're up here, we're gonna let you fly, right? It happens a lot in music. That's tension. You build up tension for the purpose of resolution. And the idea is you get purposeful resolution. The same thing is true here. We have a very tense molecule. So what are we going for? Resolution. What is that resolution? Structure. Think about it. If we take this phospholipid and we put it in water, is that phospholipid happy? Well, the polar head is happy, right? What about these nonpolar tails? Not so much. Whoops, wrong way. There. Right, not so much. You got to fix that, don't you? Well, one of the things that you do is you basically form a micelle. So you basically point all of your greasy little tails inward. That basically excludes water. There's no water inside. So you're happy now, right? Your polar heads are facing water. So these guys are now happy. You know how long it took to do that? Less than that, milliseconds probably. It's spontaneous. By the way, did you have to sweet talk this one? Did you have to beg it to do this? No, this is spontaneous. No energy needed. You get this one for free. This, by the way, is, if you're wondering, is part of that properties of water, the organizational power of water. So it's spontaneous. By the way, this isn't the only structure you can form. You can also form this one here, the phospholipid bilayer, right? So if you basically stick a bunch of phospholipids, another thing that they can form is a bilayer. So let's imagine that Jared and Kira are phospholipids and I'm a phospholipid. And so our trunks here, that's our phosphate head, right? So it's polar, and our legs are our non-polar tails. If we're just floating around in water, are we happy right now? No, because I can feel water all over my legs. So can these guys. So what's my solution? Well, I know what, I can just snuggle right in here between Jared and Kira. And now his leg is blocking me, so I don't feel water in this leg. Her leg is blocking me over here, so I don't feel water over here, right? Am I happy now? No. Why? Because I can feel water on my feet. So what do? I'm gonna have Janelle come over here and put her feet against my feet, block them. Now am I happy? Yes. Yes, because now my non-polar tails are completely surrounded, right? So here's Jared, here's me, there's Kira, here's Janelle. So now I'm happy, right? And so we just kind of keep doing that. However, here's the problem. As we're just sort of sitting here like this, so let's say that Jared is the end of it, right? So is he happy? So I'm blocking him on this side, so he's okay on this side, but on that side, you can still feel water, right? So, what does he have to do then? So he has to add somebody else on this side to block him there, somebody on this side to block his feet, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So now, are these guys happy? Okay. Yeah, kind of a continuous link, right? But can that continue forever? Is there a way to fix this problem? Exactly. The only way you can fix this is to create a circle. And then what do we get? A circle. What is this looking like? This is starting to look like the beginning of a cell membrane. That's a huge leap, right? And how much did you have to pay for that? $5. Right? It's free, spontaneous, right? It automatic. It was the organizational power of water that forced this one, and you get it for free. How long does it take to make this? Milliseconds. That's kind of helpful, isn't it? Because now you can spend all of your energy trying to figure out how to develop organelles and stuff like that to build out the rest of your cell. The cell membrane part, got it for free. I'll take it. Right? That's a big deal. So the last group of the lipids are, so the terpenes, which there's not a lot of these. Citronella is the most common terpene, but basically this is characterized by a long carbon chain, has a hydroxyl side on one side, and it's got a double bond in here. Citronella, like for instance, is the only terpene that you really run into. This is actual, if you take organic chemistry, you'll talk more about terpenes and terpene chemistry. But in biology, it's a limited group. We don't see a lot of that in biology as a molecule. The bigger one that we have is steroids. Now, a steroid is a type of lipid that is characterized by this 4-fused ring. So this 4-fused ring is common to all steroids. And the one we're looking at here is actually cholesterol, right? The dreaded enemy of cardiovascular health. It's actually not. Cholesterol actually has a normal function and a necessary function in your body. You cannot live without cholesterol. So you want to have a little bit of it. You don't need a ton of it, but you need a little bit of it for a couple of reasons. We'll see in chapter 5 that this is actually a component of your cell membrane. We'll talk about that later. So you're not going to have a functional cell membrane without cholesterol. But the other piece that's also important is that cholesterol is the precursor molecule, the foundation molecule for some of the other steroids that we actually need desperately, especially in mammals. Why? Because from cholesterol, with a few modifications, we're going to get some other steroids like testosterone and estrogen. And what do those do? Yeah, nice. Right. Those are the sex hormones, right? This is basically the sexual dimorphism of humans. This is what feminizes body tissue to make females look structurally like females. Testosterone does the same thing for males. And not only that, but these are so potent. The body is so sensitive to these that you can turn a man into a woman by just administering estrogen. Okay, so that's how powerfully potent this is. Matter of fact, this is actually one of the steps in gender transition, right? First of all, you live like the other gender. Then the next step is you take the opposite hormone, which will change your body into the opposite gender. And then the very last one that some people will exercise and some people don't is the actual surgical manipulation. Now, up to that point, obviously everything's reversible, right? But obviously surgery won't be. But is that a question? Okay, so wait, what was the question again?
Like, so when you administer estrogen, is your body tries to like,
Oh, I see. So like if somebody were to just give me estrogen, would my body reject it?
or expect to
Because I've got a Y chromosome. No, not necessarily, but it would interfere, obviously, right? Because my tissues are getting both testosterone signals and estrogen signals, so it'd be a little conflicting. So part of that, like if I wanted to do that, part of that would be, to probably reduce the testosterone signal so that you can get as pure an estrogen signal as possible. And so that's at that point you're just talking about like how to administer the hormones, how to get the most pure version of it, right? So yeah, no, not necessarily. So it depends on the response. I mean, it does vary, but usually if you're administering estrogen for that purpose, like if I'm trying to change my tissues to feminize my tissues, then usually what you're doing is you're adding so much estrogen that you're going to overwhelm any kind of regulatory variable associated with testosterone. So that's usually the case. So these are really powerful, right? So you'd also want to take cholesterol, not just for your cell membranes, but to maintain sexual dimorphism. So,
Like, is there a specific? Like you mentioned before,
well, yeah, I mean, we kind of have that information in terms of the daily value. And they've calibrated that for the daily value purposes. But that's like based on, 2000 calorie diet. So if you're not eating a 2000 calorie diet, then that gets modified. If you're eating less than 2000 calories, then that actual number goes up, right? So like you think this is only 10% of my daily value. It's like, no, it's not, because you're not eating 2000 calories. So it's actually like, 20% of your daily value, because a larger portion of your calories is accounted for this, right? So you always have to, and then people don't do that. The average bear doesn't do that because they don't keep track of the number of calories they're eating. But even when you look at those calorie numbers, unless you're eating a lot more calories than 2000, then those percentages will change. So.
I've looked this up and I've got conflicting answers. Can you see an atom?
An atom?
Yeah.
Like an individual atom?
Yeah.
I've never actually seen a picture of an atom. And that's because of quantum mechanics. We've measured it. We've measured it in other ways, but in terms of like an electron micrograph of it, no, not something like that. That'd be cool. I've looked for those, but no, that quantum mechanics thing kicks in and then pretty much all bets are off. So quantum mechanics is basically the set of physics that rules reality at that subatomic level. And it's enormously unpredictable. And it does things that are completely contrary to relativity. It's like a completely different set of rules. And when you start getting down to that atomic level, you start switching from relativity, which makes sense to us. All of our theoretical physicists can predict that very nice, very clean. And then it crosses over into quantum mechanics, and that becomes very unpredictable, very paradoxical. There's a lot of oxymoronic situations going on there, things that make our heads scratch. And so that's kind of what takes over, and that throws everything kind of off the rails.
Know how to take it and use it, because we just now started to be able to extract the surface of it.
Oh yeah, that's probably always true, right? There's probably always a situation where technically our technology could grow to a point where we're gonna be able to better measure it and understand it. I mean, that's what all particle physicists are working on. Right, and eventually we might get there. But yeah, it's a weird world down there. So chapter 4, let's dig in here. So a couple of things that I want to take a look at here in chapter 4 is the cell. So this is our cell chapter, right? And so from here on out, we're going to be talking about all the activities of the cell. So I want to start off a little bit with a little bit of background on the cell and how we kind of got to where we are. Basically, it all starts in the 17th century, right? And so we kind of start off with Robert Hooke, who's kind of like the father of cell biology. Robert Hooke is the one who actually coined the term the cell. He coined it from cork, right? So cork has those individual little circles in them. That's kind of like a cell. So when you look under microscope, you're like, well, it kind of looks similar to cork. So that's where the term comes from, the cell. But basically, when you take a look at the 17th century, the thing that made all this possible is a nice, cute little invention that came along by a Dutch inventor, Anton van Leeuwenhoek, called the microscope. And that's kind of what started it all off. Now, one of the things that I want to do is I want to take a little bit of time for this, because it is important in terms of perspective and understanding the importance of cell biology, because there's going to be a lot of work that we're going to be doing in cell biology, and it's easy to get lost in the weeds, but I want to make sure that you understand sort of the broader implications of what's happening here, because every now and then in science, unlike any other discipline, something happens in science that basically reorganizes society, right? There's these titanic shifts in the way reality works in society because of some scientific discovery. Probably the most recent one that we've run into is the nuclear bomb, right? I mean, that distinctly cut society into a before and after, right? Evolution is another big one, right? That kind of cut society into sort of a before and after. Caused people to have to sort of reorganize the way they saw things and the way they perceive things and things of that nature. That was less of a bombshell and more of a slow drip, evolution was. And it's still kind of going on. I'll kind of circle back around and talk about that one. But this one is actually probably the biggest of them all, and probably the least mentioned of them all in terms of its dramatic effects on society over time. And here's the reason why. You have to understand what society was like in the 17th century in order to understand how massively revolutionary this was for that time. Because in the 17th century, this is the Baroque era, right? This is the era of Bach and Vivaldi and Telemann, if you're a classical music person, right? For us, the US, we're still colonies. I mean, this isn't too far removed from Jamestown, right? I mean, we were still largely showing up on the shores of the US and dying for the most part, because we were still struggling to make it over the winter. That's where we are at this particular point in the 1600s, okay? So for the colonists are still largely British in nature. What else is happening in the 17th century? So we're a couple of hundred years removed from the Renaissance. So what does it mean to sort of be a Renaissance? What does that in term imply? So if you need a Renaissance, that basically means it's like almost like a resurrection, isn't it? It's like a return to what you were once, right? That's kind of inherent in the term Renaissance, almost like a resurrection. So what were we once? Yes, the Renaissance was like a secular education thing, right? So, but what were we once? a lot smarter than we were now, right? So what happened basically in this is mostly a European thing, right? This is a Western Civ thing, because when the West was struggling, the East was fine, right? So from the Middle East on to Far East, China, Asian countries, I mean, yeah, they were going through their historical cycles, but by and large, they had themselves put together. We're the ones who were a mess because of largely the fall of the Roman Empire, and it created a power vacuum and chaos, and then everything just went to hell, right? So enter the Dark Ages, which was dark, which basically is a synonym for stupid. So we were dumb, absolutely dumb. So dumb that we forgot things we used to know. That's why they call it dark, because we were intellectually dark. We were dumb. I mean, we were really dumb. We were forgetting stuff left and right. Why? Think about it for a second. Philosophy, right? Philosophy. We had great philosophy, didn't we? Thanks to the Greeks, right? We had good math, thanks to the Greeks. Engineering was awesome, thanks to the Romans. They were master engineers. They killed a lot of people, but they were master engineers. So all of that philosophy and math and engineering, that was really high during the Roman Empire. Of course, their empire crashes and everybody loses all of that. That's the reason why we had to have a neoclassical era, right? That is the renaissance of the classical knowledge. We had to go back and relearn what we forgot. Okay. So the Dark Ages. So what held Europe together during those hundreds of years of Dark Ages? Yes, it was the Catholic Church. Because at the time Rome was crumbling, the Catholic Church was strengthening. And what took over for the European countries and kept everybody connected together was the Catholic Church. So even though you were killing each other, you were like both Catholic, right? So which is weird. I never did quite understand how that worked out, but it made sense apparently to them at some point. But right, but the idea is what kept society sort of connected together was the Catholic Church, which is the reason why during the Dark Ages, I oftentimes refer to it as the Catholic Empire, which is kind of a synonym for another term you probably hear about in Western Civ, the Holy Roman Empire. Where does the holy come from? The Catholic Church, right? So the Catholic Church was critical in keeping everybody together from fracturing into absolute chaos. However, what did that create? That created a society whose reality was basically determined by Catholic dogma, right? For good or for bad, right? It wasn't all bad, right? But that's how you thought, because that's how you were trained, and that's how society. So they determined reality in terms of the Catholic Church. Yeah, they banned a lot of stuff, right? So if you were an intellectual at this particular time, you're in danger. I mean, Copernicus was rattling around before the 17th century, so that was happening, right? And he got into trouble, right? Kepler was also forming his laws, astronomers basically. He also got in trouble, right? So anybody who we would consider kind of like, a mover and shaker in terms of scientific and mathematical thought always ran into potential risk of running afoul of the Catholic Church. And that was a common reality because Catholic Church basically determined what reality was like. Now, I'm not here to kind of cast judgment on whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. I mean, the alternative was unthinkable. So we had to do what we had to do, and that's what turned it out we had to do. So we had to keep Europe together, and I guess it worked. I don't know. That's opinion for a different class. But leading into the 17th century, you still have largely a society dominated by that history. The Renaissance, you're right, was a secular uprising of scientific thought, but that was only a few hundred years before this. So that was still a very recent memory, the Renaissance, and it's still going on, by the way, in this particular period. So you still have largely a society that's dominated by theological realities. Okay, notice what's not present now at this particular juncture. You have philosophy because of the neoclassical period. You have theology because that's kind of what held Europe together. But what you don't have is science. Well, not necessarily, because at this point, they didn't really have science at all. I mean, you didn't have anybody at this point. There were no scientists. There was no concept of science. All you had was astronomers and a few alchemists rattling around. And that was it. So there really wasn't a thing that was even perceived as science. So when we get to this point, then we invent this microscope. Our everyday Joe average thinking is largely dominated and formed by Catholic Church, right? And by theological or philosophical parameters. So think about this for a second. When you come to the invention of the microscope and you take a look at little cells that are under the microscope, you don't have any perception of reality that exists beyond your visible range, right? So all of your reality is just what you can see. So you don't have any clue that there's like little bacteria there that you can't see until you invent the microscope. Not only do you not know that, but you don't even have an imagination for that. Like now we have luck because we have science fiction writers, right? And science fiction sort of theorizers, right? So we can kind of predict what the future is going to look like. And so when we get there, we're like, oh yeah, that's not such a big deal. But these guys didn't have that. They had absolutely no clue whatsoever, none at all, to give them any kind of a clue that there was this entire universe of microscopic organisms until you invented the microscope.
It wasn't Robert who invented
Van Leeuwenhoek invented it. Robert Hooke was the one who kind of started the whole cell biology movement.
So what did
Oh yeah, I mean, he looked at cells. There's no question about that. I'm not saying that he was just an inventor and he just invented it and passed it on. I mean, he was part of, he said, hey, Robert, take a look at this. I'm seeing these little things. What do you think? And I mean, he became part of that process.
Do they know each other personally?
I don't know. I've never actually read in the history that closely, because Robert Hooke was an English guy and Van Leeuwenhoek was a Dutch guy. And you weren't as well connected globally back in those days. Right? So if you think about it, though, this basically presents a titanic revelation in society. Because all of a sudden now your reality, which is limited to your visible spectrum, has now been blown wide open to things that you never even knew possibly existed. That is mind melting, right? And that just blows up your reality. There's an example that I want to give you guys, though, before we actually get to the cell theory. And I'm going to do it next time because we're at our witching hour right now. But I want to show you what an equivalent shattering kind of a revolution would be for us, just to give you a feeling for what it was like for them. And I'm going to talk about and invent ghost glasses. But I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to let you guys think about that. No, nobody's changing their life over dark matter or dark energy or membranes or black holes, none of that. So those are all cool. Relativity, actually, from which we get a lot of our dark matter calculations, is actually more earth-shattering than dark matter itself. So no, but I'm going to talk about ghost glasses, just to give you an example, and then we'll kind of set the stage for that cell biology discussion. That's exactly